When you visit a lot of companies, they'll have a mission statement, something like, to serve our customers with a high level of quality and as well as possible, or something like this, kind of very generic, I think. So the principles are meant to be more first order kind of fundamental beliefs as opposed to a goal statement. How do we need to behave? How do people need to treat each other in the company, in the community, our vendors, our customers, to be successful over the long term? And now we spend a considerable amount of time making sure that we're inculcating that culture in everything we do. The reason why they're principles is because we use them for decision making, right? So they're actually able to be accessed as a way to break ties when you're thinking about problems, or when you're under pressure in a situation from a decision-making perspective. You need to have access to your principles at those times to make good decisions. And you have to thought through those things in a time where you're not under pressure, right? Way in advance. The way we're led, the principles we have, consider the longer term optimization as opposed to this year, right? So if something will increase our profits this year but hurt us over the next 3, we never do it, right?
Hello, I'm Justin Fortier, and welcome to the Manufacturing Excellence Podcast, hosted by Seraph Consulting, where we help industrial businesses navigate and solve complex operational challenges. Today, I'm thrilled to have a guest I followed closely for several years. Like many of you, I keep an eye on what top executives are doing, and when Jeff Wilke, the former CEO of Amazon's consumer business and one of the instrumental people in building their logistics network, retired, I noticed he co-founded Rebuild Manufacturing with today's guest, Miles Arnone. I had the privilege to hear Miles talk at the Reindustrialize conference in Detroit this year, and his analysis, along with the philosophy he's built into their business, really captivated me. Miles has led machine shops, and he's been an operating partner at industrial PE firms for a while, and he's got a sharp view on diagnosing industry challenges. What excites me is how they've taken decades of leadership and hard-won lessons on incentives, hidden costs, software, continuous improvement, and more, and designed a business they believe will last for the long term using 16 foundational principles. Miles articulated the offshoring cycle really well, and that's also a topic that we dug into on Seraph's latest manufacturing report. If you want to see those, you can visit seraph.com/subscribe, and you can also see that and all the links to things related to Miles and Rebuild and their 16 principles linked in the episode description below. I'm excited for you to hear Miles's insights. Now let's dive in.
Well, I thought we could start with the parable that you told there. I'm not going to make you rehash your whole reindustrialized talk, but of Rug Doctor, because I think that's pretty helpful. I've read this writer for Bloomberg Opinion called Noah Smith, and he talks about the China cycle, which is basically the same thing that I think you could outline. So maybe you could share a bit about your experience with that company and kind of the pattern that you saw emerging that hurts manufacturing domestically.
Well, I think the general story is that I think we have to go back a little bit to a period when private equity and the finance community took a strong interest in lower and middle market companies in the US, and they started buying them up. And as you probably know, private equity sort of structure is they raise a fund, it might be a 10-year closed-end fund, and then they're going to invest that money in the beginning of that fund, let's call it years 1 to 3. And then they're going to operate the companies for some period of time, maybe 3 more years, and then they want to sell them. And the faster they can buy them and improve them, in air quotes, and sell them, the faster they can generate carried interest, which is the way the partners make money. And they can then point to realized returns that allow them to raise the next fund. So if you have a 10-year fund, you don't want to wait 10 years to raise your next one. You're usually trying to raise it at year 3, so that you end up with a cascade of funds at the same time, fund 1, fund 2, fund 3. 1, your carried interest will be better. You have more things going on, but you also often take a percentage of the fund as income to your business every year. So the more funds you're running, the more fees you get. So there's this real desire to run at a high clock speed. And, time is money, so there's some logic to that, of course. But that time constant doesn't necessarily match the time constant of every industry that they go into. They don't necessarily operate at that speed in terms of the rate at which they can make change or the rate at which they can implement those changes in a product or in the market, right? So the company you mentioned, and I think many like it, when they were bought or brought into this private equity ecosystem, they had US-based engineering and factories, and it was seen as a real opportunity to move those production plants offshore as a way to improve profits. So again, if you're a private equity owner or competing with a private equity owner, you don't think about owning the business for 10, 15, 20 years. You're thinking about 3 years. So in some sense, what's it to you if you sell the plant, all those jobs go away, and you produce the product somewhere offshore for less? And that's considered a positive thing to do. And so that happened. The problem with that is the production of electromechanical or sophisticated products is intrinsically tied to the design, right? So you learn a lot from making something as far as shaping how you will design it or improve it for the future and so on. So when you cut that cord and you move that production far away in terms of time or distance or other barriers like language or culture, it can become really hard to collect that information to inform your design work, right? So the first thing that started happening in that business and in general, I think, is that the ability of the design firms to operate at a very high level is reduced, right? And then what ends up happening is, in that specific example, they got bought by another PE firm, and then that PE firm was looking for their 3-year cycle time improvement, which really isn't even a 3-year cycle time for improvement, it's 3-year hold. So they need to make an improvement or a set of changes in a year that they can show in the second year a benefit and sell in the third year. And so then after that, what ends up happening is you have to move your engineering. That's the next thing that happens. So your supplier in China now who's making this product is very well versed in its nature, and they start to offer you, oh, we'll engineer it for you, we'll do that, and so on. And so oftentimes they start doing the engineering, and you slowly or quickly degrade your engineering capability and then move it offshore too. So now all of a sudden, what you're left with after 2 cycles is a very asset light, which was considered a positive thing, marketing and sales oriented business, right? So very little in the way of assets, high profits for sure at that point, but something that's not sustainable, right? Because what ends up happening is this firm or firms that you outsource the work to want to sell that capability to others or introduce products on their own. And all of a sudden, you're facing a competitor that's native in your product better than you are, and that can lead to real problems. So in the case of Rug Doctor, they ended up competing a lot with a company called Bissell, who worked very closely with the same manufacturers that they worked with in China. And so they didn't even end up having any differentiated product in the end, and they didn't have any engineering in-house to do anything about it. And so they really ended up in a bad way. And on top of that, of course, the private equity game means usually a lot of leverage. So in that third iteration, this business had been bought with a lot of debt. And so as soon as it starts to stumble, there's very little margin for error. So you see that a lot, I think. That's what we did in the United States for 30 or 40 years. We kind of had this short-term mentality, 1. 2, I think that we operated under this premise, which was false, that capitalism was this great force for good, and that if we sent all this production to China and worked with them and all that, they would see the errors of their ways, quote unquote, as far as the way they organize their economy or organize their government, right? I.e., autocracy, dictatorship with very few personal freedoms, and that they would convert to our much more amazing way of doing things. And of course, that's not what happened, right? All it did was allow them to take the parts they wanted, strengthen the things that they were doing in terms of the way they organize their country and their government. And now they have huge streams of income from all that production and engineering they do that we used to do that funds their misinformation efforts, their military, et cetera, right? So you had, I think, a really unfortunate set of unintended consequences. But at its base, we had capitalists essentially selling out the average person by getting rid of all these plants in the quest for short-term profit maximization. And the problem, of course, is that breaks the system, right? So the American system of democracy and capitalism is not built actually on a global agreement by everyone that these rights we have and these privileges are essential or we should defend them at all costs. It's built on the fact that it works for people. And when you stop making it work for a large proportion of the population because you took their jobs away and you leave them with cruddy service economy jobs, they start to realize that the system isn't working for them. It's in fact rigged against them in some way. And that leads to a lot of, frankly, social unrest and populism, which we see today on the right and the left. People believe that the average person, I think, in America today believes their children are not as likely to be well off as they were. And that leads to a lot of unrest, right, essentially. So we need to be able to build products and have manufacturing in this country because without it, we can't provide good jobs and a good future for people to participate in our system. Democracy is expensive. It costs a lot to run a democracy, more than to run an autocracy. And so we need a very well-functioning economy to make that happen.
And I think one of the through lines through this conversation, I hope, will be incentives. And I think we'll get to some interesting ways you structured incentives within your company. But even as you're explaining that story, I think about once the center of production is moved, so the factory is moved, you said that leads to design, which leads further up to different, or maybe some parts of engineering first, but eventually everything just makes sense to go over there, because what is that really unique capability that you have left? You might have a brand. So when you've talked about rebuilding manufacturing, I've heard you made a distinction between reshoring versus rebuilding. And I think you are working with a lot of new industries or new technology that appreciate the long-term cost, the total cost of ownership of outsourcing to other regions where there might be less control or less rule of law, different protections, things like that. Is that something that's allowed you to win more business for the new products you're working on now?
I think there are two things to talk about there. First, in terms of reshoring, we do some reshoring. So we work with companies that want to bring production back from offshore because they want to protect their IP, or they want to shore a supply chain, or they want to engage in some form of mass customization, which is hard to do with long distances in time. But generally, once a supply chain has migrated offshore, it's very hard to bring it back. It's a large systems problem, right? And so I use a simple example, like we are very unlikely to reshore, Happy Meal toy production, right? It's just not likely to happen. Everything you need to do it now, the design, the production, the piloting of it, all of that is not resident here. So it's really hard to bring that back. So we've chosen to focus on working with hard tech startups and hard tech innovators in the US to try to ensure that their newest products and services that they develop don't migrate, that we build the infrastructure to support them locally, and that they can gain the benefit of that and thereby stay local. And again, to be clear, like rebuild isn't about any kind of jingoistic thing. We think it's fine for lots of countries to produce goods, and they should do that. But we do think it's important that we be able to produce for ourselves and likewise for others, right? So this isn't about we should make things and so shouldn't. But we've for sure moved that way out of kilter as far as our own country, right? We during COVID couldn't even make masks or basic protective equipment of crazy. So yes, I do think it's proved helpful. I think companies working on new hard problems value proximity, intellectual proximity, language proximity, distance, et cetera, because they haven't worked it all out yet. What we need to do as their suppliers, ensure that over time, we are the most efficient producer and provide them with a lot of other benefits, because eventually those products will mature. And we're not interested to help them mature those products and then lose the production.
Yeah.
Right. Offshore. So it's really a two-stage process. The first stage is sort of easy to prevent the migration, i.e. when the product has a lot of uncertainty around it or instability in the design or revs. But once it becomes more stable is when you enter a different phase, right? And then your operational superiority has to be there.
Yeah.
Right. You have to really use continuous improvement. You have to be able to drive cost out, quality in, throughput up pretty dramatically, or at least incrementally over a long period of time. But you can do it.
Yeah. Definitely seem like a mission-driven company, and you've got the principles behind that. Was there anything about the specific timing that you felt like, was it labor costs rising elsewhere, or it was just the time of your life that you were ready to help co-found and lead this company?
I think Jeff and I had been concerned about this migration of manufacturing away from America for decades, right? We both ended up going to a program at MIT in the early 90s called Leadership Manufacturing that was geared specifically at trying to stem that problem. At that time, people were concerned about Japan. Japan was really doing a number on the auto industry, semiconductor industry, and machine tools, not from any nefarious, route, but they were just better. They did better methods. They were doing good work. And we wanted to do good work too, right? Because we were concerned that, if we lost that ability, it would have a real negative impact. The impacts we just talked about would happen. If you had said at that time, don't worry about Japan, it's China you have to worry about, you would have been laughed out of the room. But when 2020 rolled around and COVID, the fragility of supply chains and the lack of domestic production became very apparent. And so really, it just was about the zeitgeist, essentially. So we were fortunate enough to have been thought leaders in this area for some time, I guess, meaning we had thought about it a long time. Not that people looked at us for leadership per se. We thought about it a long time. We had concrete ideas about what to do about it. And there was a realization, both public and private, that, in the public sector, the private sector, that we have to do something about this, that this has really reached a point of national security concern and societal stability problems, right? And so I think it was really just those things coming together. We happened to be knowledgeable, and we happened to be at the right time at the right place, frankly. Like a lot of things, it's sort of luck, right? You can't project when these things are going to happen. Like no one thought about, we'll be able to launch this when there's a pandemic. Let's wait for that, and here we'll go. So that's what happened, really.
And you've announced funding from venture capitalists like General Catalyst. And I was wondering the type of business you're doing, which involves both building organically and acquiring. I know you went off on the errors of private equity in the past, and I know you worked in that industry before. How do they see, or when you speak with them, how do they see that this being different than the past, or now investable for them?
Sorry, when you say they, you mean the General Catalyst?
Yeah, like when you speak with them.
Yeah, so General Catalyst is the only institutional investor in our business. Right?
Okay.
The vast majority of the money that we raised from family offices, so very long-term thinking, well-capitalized, capital appreciation oriented investment groups that they're not closed-end funds. They're not looking to spin their money through a clothes washer or anything of this nature, right? So that was intentional. General Catalyst invested in us this year, and I would say that happened by happenstance. We didn't plan that, and I don't think they did either. They had an initiative to invest in, from a more of a startup perspective, into hard tech and the like, to try to drive resilience in the industrial sector. That was a thesis they had. I think also born of the same period that we started Rebuild, right? And they approached us about it, and we thought that they were pretty unique in their thought process. They were willing to abide our restraints around what could or couldn't happen with their capital. They can't just show up and pull it out. They can't drive a sale of the company, any of those things. And they were willing to ride along our journey on those terms that we've established as necessary to be successful in manufacturing, which was unique. We didn't meet anybody else that was able or really willing to do that at the scale that they were. And they have a fantastic network of great investments they've made and are making in hard tech ventures and the like that we think of as very synergistic with us based on what I said earlier, right? They are potential customers of ours and vice versa. So there's a real community aspect to that, a collaborative potential that we thought was super valuable. So we built a relationship with them over some time and thought they would be a good fit. We didn't need the money, which is the best time to do this kind of thing. You never want to raise money when you need it. And so we thought it was just good to build up an even stronger balance sheet because, frankly, we want to be able to be strategic, but also opportunistic. You never know what the economy will look like next year. You never know what kind of business is going to be available that you might not otherwise been able to acquire and or big programs that you want to put a lot of capital behind because you have to build out plants. And so we wanted to be stronger in that regard, and they've been a great partner.
Yeah, that makes sense because I was wondering, you defined 16 principles for your company, and I was wondering 100 years from now, what are some of the things, the early decisions you've made that will make sure that this company is not going through the tail end of the cycle where you have a third generation manager, maybe somebody who's never met the founders, who's like, you know what, we could really juice this.
Right. Well, I think it all starts with culture.
Yeah.
So the first thing that we did when we started to think, Jeff and I, about starting this company was we spent, it might have been 2 months, working on the Rebuild Way principles. So those are the 16 fundamental principles that we, consider the bedrock of the company. When you visit a lot of companies, they'll have a mission statement, something like, to serve our customers with a high level of quality and as well as possible, or something like this, kind of very generic, I think. So the principles are meant to be more first order kind of fundamental beliefs as opposed to a goal statement, let's say. So we spent a lot of time on that, and we think we've identified, not in a unique way like no one's ever thought of this before, per se, but in a way that really fits our situation, what are the important, essential beliefs we need to have? How do we need to behave? How do people need to treat each other in the company, in the community, our vendors, our customers, to be successful over the long term? So I think that's the first thing that will allow us to persist longer than average, right? And now we spend a considerable amount of time making sure that we're inculcating that culture in everything we do. The reason why they're principles is because we use them for decision-making, right? So they're actually able to be accessed as a way to break ties when you're thinking about problems, or when you're under pressure in a situation from a decision-making perspective, you can go back to these things and remember or ground yourself in what's important, right? Oftentimes in decision-making, what happens is people get under pressure, and that's when people's ethical standards or standards of quality break down. Like, people take shortcuts under pressure. That's what happens, right? Fight or flight reflexes, you lose your ability to like rationally consider what to do when you're up close, right? When you read about people that have done things they shouldn't have done, let's just say illegal or otherwise, it's often because they were under some kind of pressure, right? Financial pressure, familial pressure, social pressure, whatever it is. So you need to have access to your principles at those times to make good decisions. And you have to thought through those things in a time where you're not under pressure, right? Way in advance. And so that's important. And we did that. Obviously, our capital structure and the fact that everything we do and the decisions we make are made with the long term in mind. So we're not obviously quarterly focused at all, but we're not really even annually focused. Yes, we have goals each year from a budget perspective, a financial free cash flow perspective. We want to meet those, but we are able to, because of the way we're financed, the way we're led, the principles we have, consider the longer term optimization as opposed to this year, right? So if something will increase our profits this year but hurt us over the next 3, we never do it, right? And so as we exercise that muscle over and over again, we're almost 4 years old, which is still nothing, right? We begin to build habit, right? And that habit can persist over a long period of time. And like all things, there's danger in that too, right? If you look at companies that have been established a long time, they build cultures, and sometimes those cultures end up being at odds with what the market requires in the future, and then those companies fail, right? If that's the case, we won't be successful 50 years from now. But I like to think our principles and our way of doing things are not explicit in you must do things this way, i.e. these are the steps, but more philosophical and therefore a little more flexible, right? So you can be reactive to the changing times, but still be true to your values, right? So they're value-oriented versus tactically oriented.
Yeah, manufacturing's been happening for a long time now. So I think you have enough context to back test them against too.
That's right.
One incentive that I thought was really interesting, especially around purchasing. Well, I guess on your case, you're selling, but you talked about a split. I think you said 70-30 when you make improvements to your process that allows you to produce at a lower cost, and you share the majority with your customers, and you keep some, and you've got a working arrangement predefined from the beginning, and if they're not on board, they're not a good fit for you. How have you been able to implement that, and have you faced any unexpected challenges, or have most of them been you kind of front load by having that sort of setup where you front load the challenge with who you're working with?
Yes. So what you're referring to is this idea that as we progress producing a customer's product, if we're able to make it more cost effectively while maintaining quality and the other dimensions that are important, we want to proactively share with the customer 70% of the savings we generate and retain 30% for ourselves after any kind of, let's say, fixed costs we might have to incur, like capital or some special things of this nature, right? And the reason we drove that is because we want to be able to have a truly collaborative relationship with the customer and also a transparent one. And if you think about the 80s, I think it would be, or 90s, and this sort of GM model of purchasing where there was an individual, Lopez, who drove their kind of procurement processes there, gained a certain reputation at Volkswagen before. They would demand, a schedule of reduction in the future. Like each year, you're going to reduce your price by X% every year. And there are other companies that do this, right? This is kind of a practice. The problem with that is, so let's say you're the customer, you enforce that contract on me. What am I going to do? Well, every year I've got to make that 5%, right? Or I'm going to be in a bad position. So I'm going to run really hard to make it more than 5%. And I may also cut corners to do that. The point being, we're not aligned. Like what's in your interest here is not in my interest. It's not in my interest to cut the price 5% every year, right? Because you haven't tied it to an actual occurrence that would enable it. You're making a mandate, a fiat that I'm just going to do that regardless of whether I can find the money or not. And that's a really difficult position to be in. And so you create a moral hazard. You create the opportunity for me as the vendor to do things I shouldn't do, or cut corners I shouldn't, or treat people in an unsafe way, have unsafe working conditions, or use substandard material, basically try and get away with all kinds of things to make these targets that you arbitrarily set, right? No supplier thinks, oh, I'm going to cut corners and do bad things. But if, back to our earlier discussion, if it turns out my business ends up in a bad position, or like it's a tough year, we're not making money, maybe I'm losing money, maybe I have debt payments to make I can't make, or mortgage payments I can't make, and I have to deliver this cost reduction to you, or else I've got to find a way, by hook or by crook, to cut the cost. And that was, in some sense, the idea, right? The buyer, the customer's idea was, we're going to really motivate them to do a great job reducing cost. But the problem is, I'm getting on a little tangent, but that's kind of an ends justifying the means kind of approach, meaning my end that I want is a 5% cost reduction each year, no matter what. I really don't care how you go about it. Do whatever you have to do. That's what that sets up. And that really is problematic. And I think you see that if you look at Boeing supply chain problems lately, or many other supply chain problems, you see vendors that are failing in these very fundamental ways. And I think it's because we've set up the wrong incentives for them, and we treat them in a way that causes them to be very myopic, right? And so our approach is, we want to work with customers who are going to value and understand fundamentally that the long-term collaboration between two companies, if done right, creates way more value than a beat them over the head kind of approach. And so for us in the beginning, in the sales process and in the commercial contracting process, this idea that we should share the benefits is kind of a litmus test for us of whether we should work with the company. Because if they're not interested in that at all, or some will say to you like, well, we want it all. I want all the benefit. I want you to do all that work, and I want all the benefit. Like, that's crazy. Like, that's not sustainable. Like, we can't run a business doing all the work to improve the product and the service and giving you 100% of the benefit. Then there's no return. Yeah. Right. So that won't work over the long term. It will work for a year or two or three, and maybe longer, maybe shorter, depending on the time constant of the product, but it's just not sustainable. So for us, one, it sort of helps self-select out people. They don't choose us because they don't like that. And we're fine with that. Those that do choose us know that they're going to have a partner in us that's going to be like a real extension of their own business, right? Ability to collaborate and have less of a frictional boundary between the companies is going to allow us to make better products together and them to be more successful. Look, our goal is always for our customers to be getting the product at the right level of quality, on time, as inexpensively as possible. That will make them more profitable. That means there'll be more work for us. But there has to be alignment around that, right? And some sharing of that. And so that seemed fair to us as a way to do it. From our perspective, effectively, it's a 30% gross margin on everything that we generate as a savings, right? That's pretty good. And so, that for them to get 70% of the benefit is great. So we've had a couple of examples where we visited with customers having proactively identified savings. And I remember one in the aircraft space where we came up with changes to their parts that would reduce the price by, I think, 5%. So nothing dramatic, right? But we went to meet with them and talked about it, and they literally about fell out of their chairs, right? They said like they had never been approached by a vendor to proactively do that. I'm not talking about indices movements, like where we reduce prices because aluminum costs more or less. I'm talking about, we figured out how to make it for less, and we're coming to tell you about it. And by the way, starting Wednesday, your price is down by 5%. And they were so excited about that they wanted to move more work to us, right? Because they saw the value of essentially unleashing us to work on their problems, their cost problems, instead of having to call every day. What are you doing to reduce costs? What are you doing to reduce cost? They can be confident that we're going to be working every day to reduce costs. And we use lean, continuous improvement, through respect for people. We do what are called rapid improvement events and other types of events to drive improvement in the business. And we just altered our rapid improvement event template so that every rapid improvement event has as a part of its goal setting, what are the improvements we're going to try to get for the customers and what's going to be their magnitude. And at the end of the process, there's a follow-up process by which we calculate, collect, standardize those savings, and then we communicate them to the customer.
That's awesome. One of the first industries I worked in was automotive with Seraph, actually, when I was an intern, and was totally surprised to learn about the purchasing dynamic. One of the objectives, or the way the supplier got paid, was by sticking it back to the OEM whenever they needed to make a change. So some of those things you're talking about, being a supportive partner, the way the purchasing agreements were set up, it's so that you charge them high fees to make changes because they kind of ground you down to nothing at the beginning. So you started negative and you've got this downward fee. And so your main angle was to get them on a whole bunch of technicalities.
Right, to get them on change orders. I find that just all offensive, right? And I don't want our business to be in the business of making its money on the footnotes, basically, like in the margins of the contract. It should be, we both agree, look, we have to make money to do this job, or we're not going to be able to do well for you. And you need to make money, or you're not going to be able to sell your product. And you can't have a basic agreement around that. What are we doing?
And it creates the same sort of situation that you talked about with private equity, slightly different catalyst. But if you are a supplier, you've committed to your customer that you'll meet some sort of price reduction. You might say, okay, well, it looks like we got to move this production line halfway through the program, 7-year program for a car or something like that. We have to go to a low-cost country, and okay, surprise, so some of those don't work out great, and then your customer can no longer sell their product, or suddenly they're only able to hit 75% of their production target because the move went wrong. So there's obviously ways to mitigate that, but I think that's pretty interesting. Another incentive that was a unique answer to, well, I actually don't know if it's unique for me to solve the collaboration problem internally. I think I grew up reading, let's say, a business textbook that conglomerates were more out of style. You had people talking like Warren Buffett, who has a bunch of independent groups, but they're just managers and they don't talk together. You've managed to have something where you've got interrelated businesses, but they're distinct and they're working together, and you've actually incentivized them financially. I think I heard you talking about a few years ago where the managers of those businesses get rewarded for using the other firms within the company. Maybe you could talk about that and how that's going.
So to start, you're right. This idea of an industrial conglomerate really has fallen out of favor, right? And when you talk about a historical U.S. industrial conglomerate, you think about General Electric, let's say, up until recently when they split up. In the beginning, the industrial conglomerates that were built in the U.S. were highly collaborative enterprises that covered large swaths of the economy and had many multidisciplinary businesses, right? It worked really well at a time. They lost their competitive differentiator in part because a lot of the things that they had that others didn't, like access to capital, access to really good accounting systems, big information systems, the ability to supply and source offshore became available to a much broader swath of the economy. And so a lot of the organizing motivation for those earlier conglomerates fell away, right? But I think it's time for them again. And the reason is because products and services are increasingly complex and multidisciplinary. And in the US, we have a lot of small to mid-sized manufacturers that are very narrowly scoped. So their range of activities is narrow, and you have to stitch together many of them to get something done. And that's complicated. You have end players that have to collaborate with each other, right, in a sequence or at the same time. And that's hard to do, right? So if we're going to solve the difficult manufacturing and engineering challenges today, you need multidisciplinary collaboration. So we needed to figure out how we were going to affect that in an organization like ours, where we have, 13 sites, and there'll be many more over time, all that do very different things. But often we want to bring together to service a single customer. And actually what's really been interesting is we have seen an explosion in, I guess you just call it increased wallet share, where we work with a customer doing one thing, and then we end up doing 3 or 4 other things for them that are closely related. So we might start with a customer doing an electronics design, and then that leads to us building the wings for the drone that those electronics go in, and then we end up assembling that drone as a full, complete system because we have all those capabilities. But customers want to feel like there's to just use a kind of crass phrase, but like one neck to choke, right?
Yeah.
They don't want to deal with 4 different businesses. They want someone to own that problem, and we want that someone to be us. So we had to solve this problem of how to get these businesses to collaborate. And each of the businesses we acquired or that we build, as you would imagine, they might have locally different cultures and systems and other things like this, right? And so how do you get that all to work together? So the first thing that we did is we built into our culture that is a primary goal of our business. And, you, when I say you, I mean parenthetically, as a manager, is to promote that. So if you want something to happen, you have to measure it. So our financial systems measure how much collaboration is done. We track that, and it's a line that we talk about in that process. What we do is, if you're the company providing a collaborative service to another business, we treat that like it was an external sale. So for you, you're neutral about it. But yet the buyer, let's call it, on the other side of the ledger, for the purposes of their bonuses and how well we consider their business to perform, obviously you have to have balancing in those accounts from a financial accounting perspective. But from a managerial accounting perspective, we let you treat it like at cost. So you get it at a good price. So we eliminate the whole thing of, oh, I could get that from someone less expensive outside, right? Because the problem is, when people compare external pricing to internal, are they capturing all the fixed costs or not? There's all this kind of nonsense you have to go through. So we wanted to make it so easy that it's always a win in rebuild to buy from one of your partner companies, right? The second thing is that from an incentives perspective, or third thing, the first was culture, that's the second. The third thing is, from an incentives perspective, every rebuild employee is on the same incentive plan. Every rebuild employee owns shares or options, if they haven't vested yet, in rebuild, the overarching business, not their local entity. And they get part of their cash bonus and option bonus is based on how much collaboration was done by the member company of which they're a part. So we've created incentives that encourage that. And then again, coming back to culture, that's all fine and well, the incentives and the measurement. But if senior leadership doesn't ask for it, reward it, commend it when it happens, you'll see one of our Rebuild Pro A principles is to really, honor people that do this kind of collaboration. We do that. We have awards each year for the company that does the most collaboration. We recognize people that go out of their way to work with other parts of the business. We honor it in a way that it becomes, a badge of honor, frankly. And so people are really into doing it. People also, we find, that come to work here like to learn and they like to see and do new things. And this collaboration environment lets them do that. It lets them migrate around the business, work with other disciplines that they might otherwise have been exposed to. And for a certain kind of person, the kind of person we want to hire, that's really appealing.
And do you have anything that is enabling that electronically? I asked this because one of the things I was surprised about when I joined the workforce was that there would be factories of a large company, well-known, and they would have some shared operating system. Like that would be documented somewhere, but everything else in terms of the documents and knowledge and even who knows what was actually quite hard to access, so much so that they were hiring an outside consultant to help do something that happened at one but didn't happen at another. Have you done anything else that really helps facilitate that knowledge sharing, whether it's just, events or networks or groupings or anything like that, or technology?
Yeah. So, again, we're in very early innings here, right?
Yeah.
So one, we have a lot of events with our general managers where we make sure they understand what the capabilities of the other sites are and what they can do. We have lots of visits between people from the companies. We promote that. We have several groups that service all of the businesses. So we have a digital team that services all the businesses and kind of can see all those things. Our commercial organization is unified across the whole business. So they're selling all of those things and become aware of them. And we make sure that there's, even if you're a salesperson focusing on, say, selling composite components to aerospace, you know enough about these other disciplines that you can go into your customers and talk about them and then make the appropriate introduction. So we have a lot of systems for that. We have a program management function that spans the whole business. So when a customer requires something that spans many sites and is very complicated, we give that dedicated program management outside of the member company level so that the customer has a single point of contact and they can coordinate all those activities. So we have things of that nature. We have a software system we built ourselves called Knowledge Network. So every employee in their logs, their skills, what they're capable of doing, what they're interested in, all of the capital capabilities and process capabilities for the businesses are in there. So you can go in and search. Essentially, it's an internal search network. I need someone that knows how to weld titanium. And you'll see names of people that do that. And then you can go and just call them and reach out to them, right? And we encourage that. And then again, at the senior leadership level, we spend a lot of time visiting the sites and promoting collaboration, right? And so that's worked quite well. And now the flywheel is really going because we have a lot of jobs that require that. And it's been really exciting for each of the businesses. They're realizing that they're seeing additional sales because they're doing something with one of the other partner companies. It really motivates, that activity. Now, there will be increased systemization over time. So today, for example, a lot of our companies work on different ERP systems, right? Or they each have their own instance of a quality system like ISO 9001 or AS 9100. Over time, we'll consolidate those or standardize those so that information can flow more easily. But today we manage it as a set of transactions internally. And while that's not quite as efficient as if they were all on one system, it's not really much of an impediment, to be honest.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And one thing that I just thought about during you discussing some of the benefits there, I realized that conglomerates have been fairly popular for maybe not manufacturing, but in software. A lot of large companies have just acquired lots of things and given their clients, like Microsoft or Salesforce or something, they buy lots of products. And so they have one throat to choke to go to the head of IT and say, hey, we can deliver you any set of these capabilities. It's just a little harder in manufacturing because of the engineering and other
Yeah,
things
though
like
I
that.
think there are other forms that work. Like in Japan, you have the keiretsu. So you have these families of companies that work very closely together. Toyota is kind of the most famous, right? Where they work very closely with their suppliers in a manner almost like what we're talking about, even though they may not own all those companies,
Yeah.
right? They provide them a lot of support in optimizing their operations. They very closely collaborate about managing demand and engineering changes and all these kinds of things that we do. And in Korea, South Korea, you have the chaebol, which are like Hyundai, these big families of companies that also interact very closely. The issue for us in America is that those forms are built around their local cultures. They wouldn't work for our culture. So we're trying to develop a form of collaboration, a form of conglomeration that works in the context of the American culture, right? So for us, we think of our system rebuild as kind of a federal system. Like each of our member companies is like a state, right? States like Massachusetts has a different culture than Texas, has a different culture than California, than Montana. And you allow that and you happily want that. You want to promote that culture because it leads to some goodness, right? But you also need some global rules. And we talked about measurements that allow them to interact cleanly so that just like we have in our country, you can cross a state border and it's not like going to another country, right? The method of interacting with each other is well-defined and easy. But yet again, you could agree there are very localized, distinct cultures all around the country, right? But we're all Americans, and the differences between us are pretty small relative to the similarities. That's what we're going for.
You just mentioned that the Japanese and the Korean, they have some things that don't translate here. I know Japan has lifetime employment and South Korea seems to have a much longer commitment to workers. Was there anything else that you found culturally difficult in translating those ideas? Like, is there anything in particular that you were thinking of when you were talking about some of the difficulty of translating those one-to-one? Because I know you use TPS or Toyota Production System a lot. So it seems like there's a lot of things you are inspired by the Japanese model.
Yes, I think we are. I think the biggest difference is that Americans really value their independence almost above all things, right? So if you tell an American that, they don't have the freedom to make a decision about something, they really don't go for that very well, right? So they don't tend to think about the whole being more important than the parts that they're a part of, right? And so that's why we, in our sort of organization, allow a lot of local latitude, right? So you won't find Rebuild, the entity, visiting our sites and saying, starting next Wednesday, by the way, right, you're all going to do this process this way, right? That's just, I don't think that goes down well here. And I think the benefit of that independent streak is independence of thought, creativity, interesting problem-solving capabilities. And so we see it as a positive, right? We see it as our people are more empowered than they might be in some of the other cultures you mentioned to take on a local decision or innovate in some way. And our job as Rebuild as a whole is to provide them with the tools, which is through our continuous improvement tools, to affect those improvements locally and then to promote them globally throughout our business so other people can pick them up and use them if they make sense. So the biggest difference is that kind of mindset, right? And so I think we've tried to reflect that in our way of organizing the business and the way we run the business. And we're not perfect about that. Of course, if you were to talk to an individual at one of the member companies, they might feel that Rebuild creates too many standards, and that would be a very American kind of response. But I'd say on that spectrum of, top down versus not, we're pretty far from an overbearing top down kind of approach.
Yeah, you could introduce them to some other cultures that would correct
their view that we're being a little
their narrow
Yeah.
view, I think.
That's right.
I think probably getting into the final quarter here, the warning that you gave at Reindustrialize, which is a conference that you were speaking at, was that a lot of really smart people and ambitious in the audience, they were working on software, and you kind of hinted that, okay, this has been going on for a lot longer than you're pursuing it right now. A lot of people have said software is going to solve everything, and you were counterbalancing them with the Toyota production system and saying there's a lot of more answers here and you need some fusion. I was wondering what, on the software side, I know you've done some things, and your co-founder, Jeff Wilkie, I use software, or I receive the product from Amazon all the time, and they've got great tracking and lots of other things that I'm sure could only be enabled by software. So I was wondering, where is something that you have applied software in this business that has made it better than some of the manufacturing companies that you worked for or led in the past?
So I want to clarify your statement.
Okay.
Well, or my statement.
I could have gotten it wrong.
No. I think it's just more nuanced than that, right?
Yeah.
So software is like saying the universe, right?
Yeah.
There's a million kinds of software and it's everywhere and it's super important. You can't do anything without it. That's for sure true. What I saw at the conference that we both attended was what I fear and see in a lot of venture community is this idea that we're going to develop some kind of orchestration software, a very high abstraction layer software that's going to coordinate all of these manufacturing activities, create huge value, make a ton of money for us as investors, and that's the problem, right? The problem is coordination, okay? And it's not. The problem is the fundamentals of the manufacturing processes at the floor level themselves. The science behind the manufacturing process that leads to defects or to not having defects, the way you manage the throughput on the floor, the management of material. It's like a very detail-oriented situation. When you talk about Amazon and their software, I think the reason why they've been unbelievably successful and really radically changed the whole consumer product distribution model is because their software operates all the way down to like the most minute aspect of operating a warehouse, right? And what I've seen a lot of interest in, and this goes for robotics too, is driving very high level concepts, right, as business models. And I don't think that's what's needed. What's needed is a focus on the tactical work of making things. And that requires subject matter expertise. And the people that we met at that conference largely were people that had pure software, in many cases, pure e-commerce backgrounds, believing they could take that knowledge and apply it in a general way to manufacturing and solve a problem. But they're chasing a problem that I think they're sort of doesn't really exist. They're sort of creating. The problem is, again, the tactics. So if I'm running a machining business, right, it's not, sure, there's a problem of routing work to the floor and what work order I should work on and all these kinds of things, but that's not the primary problem. The primary problem is, how do I optimally program making this part to run on this machine with as little error as possible and maximize the throughput on that specific job? And that requires a lot of tactical knowledge. So when we think about software, we have a very substantial investment in software ourselves. We have a group in Los Angeles of software engineers, and we have digital engineers, we call them, all around the organization. We're focused on developing software that solves those kinds of problems. So, for example, software that is tied intrinsically into production equipment and monitors the variables of that production equipment and helps us to adjust the production process in real time. Not, how long has my spindle been up today? Kind of basic stuff, but much more fundamental data collection and decision-making, for example, right? Or processes that do things like optimize the way in which we quote a product. So help us to more rapidly and accurately quote work to customers and accurately reflect what it will cost to do the job. That requires lots of very specific knowledge, right? Not just a workflow, right? Mm-hmm. And I see a lot of people trying to develop workflow software with no regard for the content that's going to be used. And that's a dead end, I think. It's much harder to figure out the content aspect. Like, what does it really take to make a composite part than to drive the workflow of creating a quote from that information?
Yeah, one of the experiences I had, I was in a logistics warehouse on a consulting project. And at the time I was developing you could call it a scheduling algorithm, because they had a bunch of different sea containers coming into a very large cross-docking facility, and each of them had different things on their manifest, and they there was lots of opportunity to improve how they ordered it, which way they worked the containers, and what type of team they assigned to that. But I was enjoying the opportunity to learn about it. But I did wonder, how can companies better use software? Because it seemed like I did it in Excel, we got it to work, but there's definitely a higher level of software capability that I wish was in that company
For sure.
working. And so I wonder, how have you been able to use that software team? Like, how do they prioritize problems? Is that driven by the business unit leader to bring them in? Because I know a lot of times a business might be a little wary of going, wow, okay, that cost is really high compared to that would be one of the highest paid people in my facility potentially. And how am I going to make the most use of that versus?
Yeah, so there's two things to note there, I think. First, with respect to the example you gave, right? It's a great example because the actual value add there was all built around specifics, right? What is in this container? What team needs to go work on it? Like that information and knowing what that information is, what the pertinent information is what led to you to be able to solve a problem, right?
Mm.
Whether you implemented in Excel or did something else with it is really almost immaterial at that point, right? It was the insights around the specifics of that process. So again, a low level of abstraction kind of approach, right? In our business, there's two things. One, we don't charge any of the member companies for that kind of software work and the like. We provide it as a quote unquote free service to them to encourage use. Because if you go and meet with the people that run a lot of factories or engineering businesses, sure, engineering businesses use CAD, CAM tools and all that. But I don't think in a lot of cases that they have a good appreciation of what software or digital means could do to improve their business. That it's not something that they spend a lot of time thinking about beyond the standard tools. So our first job is to create awareness of how these tools can be helpful. And that's by solving fundamental problems. And the way we do that is we use our continuous improvement methodology. We want to focus on the bottlenecks and we want to focus on the things that are impeding the business's progress. So, for example, we have a business in Cleveland that quotes a huge number of metal fabrication jobs for aerospace applications. And the quoting process is very laborious. And it's also heuristic in a bunch of people's minds. Like you can't go look up a book and this is what you should do. So it can't scale, right? Like we can add equipment and add people to do the work all day, but we can't scale the input unless we can distill that knowledge from people's minds and make it into an algorithmic approach, right? Which is again, a very, I don't want to say basic, like simple. I mean, basic, like fundamental kind of application of software. And then after you do that, you can start talking about a more sophisticated piece of software that will manage the workflow in which those details are. So again, we're early in our journey. What we're really focused on is that blocking and tackling software that fixes problems or addresses challenges people have or makes people's jobs easier versus very high concept ideas like we're going to have a digital thread through our whole business and I'll be able to sit at my desk and see information about every machine and how it's running and what the utilization is and all that kind of thing. That's not a pipe dream, but it's so far from where the value add point is that I don't think people, and we don't think we need to really spend our time on that today.
Yeah, we've talked to a lot of leaders of different manufacturing companies that have pursued Industry 4.0 type initiatives like that and then struggled to see the
They're super expensive.
The adoption.
Yeah.
Because I think for anything to be effective, you need people to use it.
It has to solve their problem.
Yeah.
So we're much more a fan of an incremental, give me value in the near-term approach to win hearts and minds and get people on board with the idea that, hey, this voyage towards that wonderful digital thread future is a good journey. And there's a lot of steps along the way that will bring me a benefit in my work versus otherwise, if you sort of talk about this big overarching play, they start thinking about that time when they had to implement SAP and the nightmare that they had and what a disaster. And they think that's what you're going for. And a lot of people are going for that. And they have those disasters, right? And we don't want that. We want it to become just another tool that people have to improve the business.
Awesome. And as a final question here, you've got both services all the way to production. And so how'd you think about which companies you needed to start with? And where are you going? Do you think you'll continue to acquire companies your whole time, or eventually you'll be mostly building internal capabilities? How do you think about it?
Yes, we have a series of engineering services businesses and then part and system production businesses. And we started focusing initially on both engineering services and production in the area of composites. So we focused on a target market area, and we needed the full suite of capabilities there. So we can engineer parts and design the production process and build those parts end to end. And model we keep replicating into other areas. So it's not engineering or production, it's always both. And our view is that on a go-forward basis, we will continue to be acquisitive. We just acquired a business that has really awesome software for designing and managing the production of wire harnesses, for example, which is an area with lots of challenges. And then we'll build up around that, right? Going forward, absolutely, the balance will shift from 100% acquisition, which is how we started because we didn't have any footprint, to much more of a 50-50 between organic build out and buying, because we're now at a scale and we have the capabilities and the systems to be able to build and stand up our own capabilities more cost effectively than acquiring them, right? If you acquire a business, if you're lucky, you're paying 7 times EBITDA. So that's 7 years of profit, right? You can obviously stand up the business typically for less than that. Now that we have been building a very substantial nationwide sales system and all the infrastructure like that, we can flow through new products and services much more easily. Therefore, we can build them versus when we were buying, it was also to buy access to the market. We didn't have a sales channel. So we're entering a different phase and we'll be much more organically oriented. The other reason for that is, yes, we do engineering services and we build parts, but now, as we were talking about through our collaboration, we are building systems that encompass many different kinds of parts and many different elements of engineering. And that gives rise to larger capital needs to build facilities to produce those large systems, or think landing gear for an aircraft or make line automation for restaurants. Those require dedicated production facilities that we have to build.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time and for your vision. It's inspiring. So appreciate it.
I really appreciate it. Great to be here. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Manufacturing Excellence Podcast, hosted by Seraph Consulting. If you want to learn more about us and our work, you can visit us at seraph.com. Now, if you've made it this far to the end of the episode, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit follow or subscribe or whatever the term is on the platform you're listening to, because that helps me and the team to record more episodes with interesting manufacturing leaders. So thank you for listening. If you have an interesting guest or you have an interesting topic for a future report, email us at research@seraph.com. You can find me on LinkedIn at Justin Fortier. We always appreciate suggestions and feedback about the latest and greatest of what's happening in manufacturing around the world. Thank you and have a great day.